Hello everybody, and welcome to your fantasy point show for the NFL. My name is Andrew Tanner, and I'm here to tell you who's leading in fantasy points. Week 2, the best quarterback was Tom Brady. He had 38.78 points, and why not? 3 touchdowns, no interceptions, 447 yards on the air. He's back. Leading quarterbacks for the whole season in terms of fantasy points, still Alex Smith. 5 touchdowns, 619 yards, 47.16 fantasy points. But Tom Brady in week 2, he had 30.78 fantasy points. So, Alex Smith still leading the cream of the crop, but Tom Brady was the cream of the crop for week 2. Put him back up there in terms of quarterbacks. For week 2, Denver Broncos, C.J. Anderson led week 2 in fantasy points for running backs with 27.8 points. Had 118 rushing yards and a touchdown. And by the way, he could also catch receiving 36 yards by receiving and 1 caught for a touchdown. But if you like yards, Carlos Hyde, 124 rushing yards, but no touchdowns. I like touchdowns. And C.J. Anderson, 118 rushing yards and a touchdown. Rushing, the only rusher with both 118, at least 100 rushing yards and a touchdown. It's confusing as heck, but hey, he did something what no rusher did this week. Over 100 rushing yards and a touchdown. By the way, he also had a receiving touchdown too, so hey. C.J. Anderson for week 2. So far for the season, cream of the crop again. It's in Kansas City. Kareem Hunt is leading rushers in fantasy points so far this year. He has 63.50 fantasy points so far this year. Why not? Over 200 rushing yards, 3 touchdowns, over 100 reception yards and 2 touchdowns. So he's doing it big in terms of rushing and receiving. Like, how can you go against that? And then you go for total yards, rushing. He's the only running back over 200 yards already. C.J. Anderson has 199, but look at Kareem Hunt. Chiefs like their running backs. Why shouldn't they? He's also leading all running backs this year with 126 rushing yards. So, Kareem Hunt so far, as a running back, I like him so far this year. Week 2 for wide receivers. J.J. Nelson had 120 yards and a touchdown, but did not lead the league in fantasy points this week. He only had 18 fantasy points. Now, in terms of cream of the crop, in terms of fantasy points, Michael Crabtree, 80 reception yards, 3 receiving touchdowns this week, led all receivers in fantasy points with 26 fantasy points. What a week for Michael Crabtree in terms of fantasy points. Leading the year in fantasy points in terms of receivers, Michael Crabtree again, 163 yards, 3 touchdowns, 34.30 fantasy points. Now, in terms of receiving yards, I do like yardage. Yardage speaks volumes. Antonio Brown, 244 receiving yards, but no touchdowns. Where's the yards, buddy? Come on, man. Antonio Brown needs a freaking touchdown in week 3. That's who I'm rooting for. That's why I feel like he needs a touchdown. Just give me the yardage. But in terms of fantasy points, Michael Crabtree's doing it all. But hey, there's one team out there. Yeah, one team out there with multiple receivers in the top 10. Can you guess that so far this year? Can you guess it? Give you a clue. One of my favorite teams. Ooh, look. Wait. Do I have to? Yeah, I have to go this way. Hold on. Is that a cheesehead behind me? I like my football. Week 2 fantasy points for tight end. Gronkowski. Now there's some news on him. I'm going to get to that in a minute. But he did lead tight ends in fantasy points with 17.6 fantasy points in terms of yards for tight ends. Also led the league in yards this week. Now, there is some news on him. I'm going to get to him really quick. He had a groin injury this week. Relayed Monday that the groin injury he suffered in week 2 action is nothing serious. Noted that he considers his status day to day. New England, you could breathe. It's not that serious. I know, man. I love him. Every week, man. This guy always performs well. But he did lead week 2 in both yards and fantasy points, and he also had a touchdown. Tight ends, touchdowns. Hey, he also, a lot of players with touchdowns, but Gronk, man, he can breathe. Best tight end so far this season. In terms of fantasy points, Jason Witten. In terms of yards, I like my yards. Zach Ertz of the Eagles, leading the cream of the crop in yards. But he does not have a touchdown. He doesn't even have 20 fantasy points. Underrated in terms of points, in terms of touchdowns. He's leading the league in terms of yardage for tight ends. But in terms of fantasy points, Jason Witten, man, cream of the crop in terms of fantasy points. There is news on Jason Witten. Witten caught 10 of 13 passes for 97 yards and a touchdown. Sunday's loss to the Broncos. He's Dallas' all-time leader in catches and receiving yards, added another franchise records to his tally when he passed Ed Tutal Jones and played his 225th game as a Cowboy. Witten also leapfrogged Chris Carter and Marvin Harrison to take 4th place on the NFL's career receptions leaderboard with 1,106 receptions. The future Hall of Famer had a great start, and with the number tops, he looks very safe and fantasy holder. Harbor, he's doing really good. In other words, but he did add some stuff to his already Hall of Fame career. So Jason Witten, I love you, man. Stay healthy, please. But he's leading the cream of the crop in terms of fantasy points already this year. So for week 2, went a different guy, Rob Gronkowski. Dude, have you seen the guy? Holy crap. This guy's a beast, man. I mean, have you seen him spike the ball? He spikes it like it's nothing. Bam! Kills that football. No wonder Tom Brady's balls are always flat. He's spiking them too hard. You know, when he's got big hands too. Like, dude, you gotta put like, bam. Okay, now we could probably try crap. I don't know. His hand's probably bigger than my head. Just saying. Best defense, week 2. One thing I like is a team that does not give up points. Carolina Panthers defense allowed the fewest amount of points in week 2, with 3 points allowed. But somehow that did not lead the league in terms of fantasy points. For defense, the team that led the league in fantasy points was the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, with 19 fantasy points. They only allowed 7 points as well, so I kind of like them. Defensive touchdowns, Denver Broncos scored a touchdown, as well as the Buccaneers and the Falcons. Yeah, it was a pick 6 for Denver, by the way. Interceptions, Baltimore had 4 in week 2. Wow, 4 picks, man, for Baltimore. Get to them in a minute. Fumbles recovered in week 2. Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Oakland Raiders, both had 2. Sacks, man, when you get to that quarterback, you got to do your sack dance, man. You know, I remember a couple of years ago watching the Dallas Cowboys on a turkey day and gobble, 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 turkey dance. All right, sacks, man, Kansas City, Buffalo Bills both had 6 sacks. Chiefs and the Bills. Safeties. I don't think anybody had any safeties. So that's week 2 in terms of defensive fantasy points in your week 2 leaders. Week 2 fantasy points. Let's start out with fewest points allowed this season. This is remarkable. Tampa Bay Buccaneers only allowed 7. Carolina Panthers only allowed 6 points. We're talking total defensive points allowed through 2 weeks. Congratulations, Tampa Bay and Carolina. You guys are doing a wonderful job. I haven't heard much talk about you in the talk shows. You guys deserve more credit than what you guys are getting so far this year. Now let's get to fantasy points. Who's helping who out in terms of fantasy points so far this year? Baltimore Ravens has 42 fantasy points. You know, 8 interceptions so far this year, 8 sacks so far this year, 2 fumbles recovered so far this year. They're doing it all on defense so far this year. What a wonderful year that they're having. But nothing. I mean, I love the way that the Panthers and Buccaneers are playing so far this year, and those 2 teams should be higher up in the rankings in terms of fantasy football on defense. But the Ravens, man, interceptions, I do like my interceptions, and so far they have 8 this year. Nobody's coming close to them this year on interceptions. I mean, Denver Broncos claim that they have the no-fly zone. Well, Denver only has 3 picks so far this year. Look at Baltimore. They have 8. That's a 5 differential in terms of interceptions. Fumbles recovered. So far leading the league in fumbles recovered. The Eagles and the Jaguars are in the top, tied for first. And then you have the Ravens, and they're tied for third with 2 fumbles recovered. So the Ravens defense, again, up there in terms of defense. And then you got the Ravens up there again, tied for 4th in terms of sacks. So how can you go against them? And then you have the Jaguars, who are leading the league in sacks, yet they allowed 44 points so far this year. Come on, Jacksonville. Like, you guys are getting to the quarterback, yet you guys are still giving up points. Scores so far, leading the league in defensive scores. The Los Angeles Rams with two touchdowns, and the Los Angeles Rams, the only team with safety. Yeah, how about that? And then in terms of returns for a touchdown, the Lions, the only team that they could say that they have a return for a touchdown. So those are your defense leaders so far this year. Hey, I'm liking this year already. So week 2 fantasy points, Tom Brady led the cream of the crop in terms of fantasy points with 30.78. Again, if you want to pick from the same tree, there's multiple players or multiple teams who always end up with the top 10. Or with there's always that one team that's going to have multiple players in the top 10. Sorry about that. The Broncos had 2 players crack the top 10 in fantasy points this week. Trevor Siemian with a really good week. He had 22.64 fantasy points. He was number 8. Number 2 in terms of fantasy points, C.J. Anderson with 27.40. Now, earlier in the video, I did ask who has multiple receivers leading receiving yards. That is the Green Bay Packers. Devontae Adams at number 7 with 146 receiving yards. Randall Cobb with 145 receiving yards. Between the two players, they only have 1 touchdown. I don't get it. And Antonio Brown should have way more touchdowns. He's got 244 receiving yards. He's leading the cream of the crop in terms of receiving yards. Tyreek Hill of the Chiefs is up there in terms of yards too. He's number 3 at 176. And he also has a touchdown. But he's got more fantasy points than Antonio Brown. Imagine that. So in terms of receiving yards, you got to go to Green Bay. If you like your fantasy points, 2 receivers on the same team again. So far this year in terms of fantasy points, the Eagles with 2 receivers in the top 10 in terms of fantasy points. Nelson Aguilar, I believe, and Alshon Jeffrey is leading receivers in terms of fantasy points. Both of those 2 are in the top 10. I'm sorry about saying that they're leading the league in fantasy points because they're not, but they both are in the top 10. They both play for the Eagles, and Aguilar has 21.50. Jeffrey has 21. So, between the Eagles, the Packers, I like those 2 teams in terms of fantasy points so far this year and receiving yards so far this year. It's a weird season already, and we're only through week 2. Don't forget to tune in next week in terms of fantasy leaders for week 3 of fantasy football. Also figure out who's leading what after week 3. So week 3 leaders and your season leaders after week 3.